Welcome back to the Truth Factory. So far this year, we've somehow managed to transition the UN-sponsored Greta PSYOP into a UN-sponsored pandemic PSYOP, and now we're all distracted by an all-out race war probably sponsored by the same people who sponsored it in the last election year. And this is probably totally unrelated, but George Soros' Open Society held a meeting in 2016 entitled Police Reform: How to Take Advantage of the Crisis of the Moment and Drive Long-Term Institutional Change in Police Community Practice. This leaked document shows that his foundation wanted to create a national movement in order to reform the police. It identifies Black Lives Matter as central to advocating for specific reforms. Another Hack Soros document confirmed that the Open Society in 2015 approved $650,000 to invest in technical assistance and support of the groups at the core of the burgeoning #Black Lives Matter movement. The Open Society also called for a discussion on whether it would be appropriate for the Soros Group to try to shape Black Lives Matter in the future. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The Washington Times has reported that Soros' Open Society Foundation gave $33 million in grants to the Black-led movement that funds Black Lives Matter. And the Ford Foundation donated $100 million. So this is seeming less and less grassroots and a lot more astroturfed by globalist elites. Now, a second document from the Open Society board meeting shows that Black Lives Matter worked to influence the 2016 presidential campaign. The Hack document states, leaders of the Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives worked to influence candidate platforms during the 2016 primary season. They would use alleged police abuse to create first local reform and then see how it could be leveraged into a national movement. But it doesn't end there. Since 2014, Soros has spent over $11 million funding 14 candidates for low-profile district attorney races across the country. 10 of them are now in office. This is important because they have the ability to implement reforms at their own discretion, or perhaps at Soros' discretion since he bankrolled them into their positions. Of course, this move is done under the cloak of reforming the justice system. However, the ultimate goal that these documents point to is putting enough pressure around police abuse that they can push for a nationalized or federally controlled police force. I can only assume that they would want this because it would be far easier to manipulate the entire justice system this way. That's how globalists work. And you already have a federal police force. It's called the FBI, and they're entirely corrupt. But nationalizing the police benefits the political elite, not the people. And the fact that all of this is playing out right before a major election, well, what a strange coincidence. Of course, when foreign billionaires give money to right-wing politicians to influence policy, it's foreign collusion. When foreign billionaires give money to left-wing politicians, it's donation. Now, based off all of these documents, it shows that a total coup of the American police system has been in the works for several years. I'm sure Soros and his cohorts were just salivating for a George Floyd type event. This was never really about defunding the police. It's just a power grab. The left is using a tragedy in order to enact authoritarian social control cloaked in the language of identity politics. And if you question this, the social justice mob that they've curated will paint you as a racist, regardless of the truth. The same people who are upset about racial profiling by the cops are now encouraging everyone to have a blanket attitude about every police officer based off of stereotypes. Do you see the hypocrisy here? And the controlled media has now successfully dehumanized the police and convinced Americans that white police officers are the biggest threat to Black lives. Even cringy white celebrities are now weighing in on this as an epidemic.
I take responsibility. Black people are being slaughtered in the streets.
And killer cops must be prosecuted. They are murderers.
Yet what the media and many in the Black Lives Matter movement are totally Helen Keller about is that approximately only 14 unarmed Black people were killed last year by the police in the United States. And that number seems to be dropping year after year. That's actually a very small number when you consider that America has a population of 383 million people. In fact, more Black people have died just in the riots. 24 people were killed in Chicago just over a weekend this month. Yet you won't see their names on the Black Lives Matter signs or plastered all over CNN. They also won't tell you that in 2018, 7,407 African Americans were murdered in the United States. Black people make up approximately 13% of the American population, yet they account for the majority of homicide victims, and statistically, over 93% of those Black homicides were committed by other Black people. That is the biggest threat to Black lives, not white cops.
Modern anti-racism turns a blind eye to most Black homicide. Anti-racism, as currently configured, turns a blind eye to Black young people's upward mobility. It turns a blind eye to doing the kinds of things that civil rights leaders of 50 years ago considered ordinary, in favor of what is ultimately an inwardly focused quest for moral absolution that has at best a diagonal relationship to helping people who've been left behind.
Yes, Black people are killed by the police at a disproportionate rate, but they also commit violent crimes at a disproportionate rate. It's the same reason why men are killed by the police at a disproportionate rate to women. It's not that hard to figure out. Yet I've never seen an army of protesters accusing the police of being sexist against men. And as I stated in my last video, in fatal shootings specifically involving a white officer, the person shot is not any more likely to be a racial minority. But yes, unarmed people being killed by the police, that's a problem. And we can try to find a reasonable solution to that, but framing this as a racism epidemic and the biggest threat to Black lives in America is not only statistically incorrect, pushing this notion has been highly destructive and deadly. And the media doesn't help. People are now reacting with anger, they're reacting with fear, but watch what happens when this outspoken Black Lives Matter activist experiences use of force police training.
We want his badge, we want his gun, we want his job.
Today, he accepted an invitation to look at things from the other side, agreeing to go through a force-on-force training session with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office.
What do you want? What's happening here?
What's wrong with
Back
you?
up.
Huh?
You just shot him?
Hey, he rushed me.
Tell me why you shot.
Well, I've shot because he was within that zone. You know, I felt there was an imminent threat. I didn't necessarily see him armed, but he came clearly to do some harm to the officer, to my person. It's hard to make that call. It shakes you up. I didn't understand how important compliance was, but after going through this, yeah, my attitude has changed. This is all unfolding in 10 to 15 seconds. People need to comply with the orders of law enforcement officers for their own sake.
I think that's a pretty powerful takeaway. Here are some more important stats to evaluate in this conversation. Every census from 1890 to 1950 showed that Black labor force participation rates were higher than those of whites. Before 1960, the number of teen pregnancies had been decreasing. Both poverty and dependency were declining, and Black income was rising in both absolute and relative terms to their white counterparts. In 1965, 76.4% of Black children were born to married women. The significant expansion of federal welfare under the Great Society programs began.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
And while this program was well-intentioned, not only has it cost over $20 trillion, it's also been criticized as a contributing factor to actually increasing poverty and leading to the destruction of the African American family unit, because the system discourages work and it penalizes marriage.
What the welfare system and other kinds of governmental programs are doing is paying people to fail. Insofar as they fail, they receive the money. Insofar as they succeed, even to a moderate extent, the money is taken away. This is even extended into the school systems, where they will give money to schools with low scores. Insofar as the school improves its education, the money is taken away, so that you are subsidizing people to fail in their own private lives and become more dependent upon the handouts.
Marriage rates began to decline in the 1960s, however, birth rates did not. This only caused more financial disparity and economic dependence. There is a dramatic difference in poverty levels between married and non-married people with children under 18 across all races. As marriage rates decline, poverty follows that. This was further exacerbated when the war on drugs began, which started under Nixon but really took off to a national movement under Reagan.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
Now, most people blame Reagan for the mass incarceration issue still plaguing America today, but what you likely won't hear is that it was actually Biden who was among the biggest policy pushers for the war on drugs and mass incarceration. According to this New York Times article from 1983, Reagan actually initially vetoed the signature piece of Biden's legislation to create a federal drug czar. Reagan had little interest in an expansive federal spending program geared towards building new prisons and creating a police state. It was Joe Biden that was the key policy leader on expanding this funding to fight the war on drugs. He was also the architect behind the Biden-Thurmond bill that increased penalties for drugs. And once again, Reagan vetoed Biden's bill, although many of the priorities from it would eventually be signed into law anyway. Around this time, the CIA also wanted to fund the Contra missions in Nicaragua. Now, these Contra missions were not approved by the government, but the CIA did it anyway. And in order to fund their illegal covert missions, they used drug dealers to traffic cocaine within the black community, contributing to the crack epidemic, which absolutely destroyed entire generations. Now, this was a conspiracy theory for years that the government kept denying. And the main journalist Gary Webb, who tried to expose the truth, was suppressed, slandered by the mainstream media, and eventually died of a suspicious suicide when he shot himself in the head multiple times.
My name is Gary Webb. I am an investigative journalist. I've been an investigative journalist for about 25 years for daily newspapers. And in 1996, I wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance, which was about CIA involvement in drug trafficking. The cocaine that was being sold in those neighborhoods was coming from mainly one source, and this one source was being used to finance a guerrilla war in Central America.
Webb was eventually vindicated in 1998, when the CIA Inspector General report revealed that for more than a decade the agency had covered up a business relationship it had with Nicaraguan drug dealers, and they found payments to drug traffickers from the US State Department. Perhaps I should also mention that Biden, while pushing the war on drugs, specifically crack at this time, was also on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which reviewed DEA reports on the illicit drug trade, which means he should have been completely aware of the corruption happening by his CIA allies. All I'm saying is that mysterious bricks showing up to bait black communities into committing crimes is not a new thing.
Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society.
So now you have a large portion of the black community already dealing with poverty, and now many of them are addicted to crack thanks to the CIA. Then Biden in 1984 shapes the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which curtailed access to bail, eliminated parole, created a sentencing commission, and an expanded civil asset forfeiture. Biden then helped lead the push for the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which lengthened sentences for many offenses, as well as created the infamous 100-to-1 crack versus cocaine sentencing disparity, which of course led to a disproportionate amount of black people being incarcerated compared to white people.
The president says he wants to wage a war on drugs, but if that's true, what we need is another D-Day, not another Vietnam, not another limited war, fought on the cheap and destined for stalemate and human tragedy.
These and other laws contributed to the explosion of federal imprisonment from 24,000 locked up in 1980 to almost 216,000 in 2013, and that's not even the last of it. Joe Biden also wrote the 1994 crime bill that is often blamed on Bill Clinton, which authorized more than $300 million of spending, leading to a boom in for-profit prisons and mass incarceration. Don't just take my word for it, take Biden's word for it.
I had spent years writing what became known as the Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill. Democrats. Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill.
Biden's 1994 crime bill, while implementing sweeping gun control, also helped fuel mass incarceration with financial incentives to keep people behind bars.
The Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill.
Biden crime bill is before us. The truth is, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill, has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden, on that bill.
Change the law so that if you are arrested and you are a drug dealer, under our forfeiture statutes, you can, the government can, take everything you own Everything from your car to your house, your bank account.
Back when Bill Clinton's crime bill passed, Joe Biden was such an outspoken supporter, he said, quote, "I'd like to be running and have someone use the crime bill against me."
Biden also bragged about creating the Patriot Act after 9/11. So just to clarify, presidential candidate Joe Biden, that Democrats are going to vote for because they are mad at the police, is largely responsible for the modern American police state that they're supposedly all against. Isn't it a little bit ironic, don't you think? His policies only exacerbated the issues of black incarceration and further destroyed the family unit. There's a very clear graph here of that happening. And this had a very strong echo and is still at the root of many issues today. Only 29% of African Americans are married compared to 48% of all Americans. African Americans now have the highest rates of non-marital births in America, sitting around 77%. And over 57% of them have absent biological fathers. This often leaves children without a consistent male influence. The kids go to school where the vast majority of the teachers are female, and without a positive male role model to help shape their identity, these adolescents are forced to fill in the gaps of how men should behave without having first-hand demonstration. They may tend to lean on more negative male figures to emulate, and there is a large body of literature that shows that children from fatherless households are dramatically more likely to take their own life, to drop out of school, to become homeless and commit crimes including gang involvement, drug abuse, and sexual crime. Young men without a strong male role model are 67% more likely to be unemployed than their counterparts, and 50% more likely to abuse drugs, as well as more likely to turn to crime when unemployed. Interestingly, youth in father-only households display no difference in the rate of incarceration from children coming from that of two-parent households. Statistically, the more time a child spends with a strong male figure or their father, the less likely they are to go down this path, meaning that toxic masculinity is not the problem. It's the lack of masculinity in the first place. Fatherless children are more likely to get divorced, and girls are 4 times as likely to get pregnant as teenagers, restarting the same cycle. Now, this doesn't mean that if you don't or didn't have a strong male role model that this is inevitable. It just statistically puts you at a higher risk for obstacles in life. Until you fix racial crime disparity, you will not eliminate the racially disproportionate incarceration rates or the disproportionate amount of police killings. A lot of the issues happening after 1960 can be directly correlated to the breakdown of the family unit, which would logically point to repairing the disproportionate breakdown in the nuclear family among African Americans should statistically have the highest positive impact on the Black community and Black lives, by improving poverty and crime rates. This is also true among all races. This is not an opinion, this is based off of countless amounts of literature, studies, and statistics. It's people like this teacher who have created a role model club for children without fathers that are doing far more for the Black community than any destructive rioter ever could. One is building the community up, the other is literally tearing it down.
I absolutely love it, and I am honored that my son is a part of this wonderful, dynamic group. It warms my heart that these gentlemen take their time out to mold our future men.
Thank you so much. Oh, you hit the marble? Don't put your elbows on the table. That's right. There you go, Mom. Let them know.
It's not hard for us to give up our time when we think about the hundreds and thousands of millions of kids who don't have that kind of support, who are being lost every single day to the streets, to whatever, drugs and violence and different things. So when we think about that, we think about saving one child.
I guarantee that more programs like this would make a noticeable difference for children without positive male role models in any community. Even Black Lives Matter activist Shaun King gets it right when he says, "In Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was killed, we have a Democratic governor, a Democratic mayor in Louisville, and a Democratic district attorney, and they've each done a half step above nothing. Crumbs, really, for Breonna Taylor and her family. It's infuriating. Guess who made the single strongest statement on this ludicrous no-knock warrant used to murder Breonna Taylor from a national politician? It was Rand Paul, the Republican senator from Kentucky, not a Democrat. He said that they should be banned altogether nationwide. But of course he did. No-knock warrants should have never been a thing. Rand has also long called for demilitarizing the police. He was saying this after Ferguson. Other libertarian stances that would realistically help is ending Biden's failed war on drugs, or at least weed. 40 years later, it's cost over $1 trillion, and we're still fighting the war on drugs, and it turns out drugs won. They're easier to get than ever before. So perhaps redirecting emphasis and funds towards ensuring victims of violence, sexual assault, and robbery get full and credible investigations would be better than it going towards the man-hours of arresting millions of people who have never restrained, assaulted, killed, or abused another person. Those are all things that could help undo Joe Biden's historical mistakes. Trump has also recently tackled police reform with an executive order limiting police chokeholds, as well as ordered a creation of a federal database of police misconduct. Again, very reasonable actions to address the issues of police brutality that don't require defunding the police. But if Soros gets his way, the police will be nationalized, Trump will be out of office, and Biden, the root of the American police state and mass incarceration, will be in power, pushing us one step closer to their New World Order agenda. And this is why criticizing the hidden motivations behind the Black Lives Matter movement is reasonable. Because if Black Lives Matter, they should matter all the time, not just in an election year, not just when the media is talking about it. They matter when people die during the riots, they matter when people die on the streets of Chicago, they matter when the nuclear family in the Black community is imploding and that children are growing up without fathers because of mass incarceration and black-on-black homicide. And while I agree with common sense resolutions to police brutality, it is so far down on the totem pole for what is actually killing Black people by the thousands every year. But looking at all of this, you could easily come to the conclusion that the collapse of the African American community was intentional, and that Democrats want the Black community dependent on the government so that they can count on the votes forever.
I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't Black.
Thank you so much for watching, thank you for supporting me, and have a great night.